During the production of Resident Evil 2, series producer and director of the original game Shinji Mikami shared an idea with other members of the team. With the growing interest in online gaming in the late 90s, he suggested that the team try to make an online Resident Evil game in which players would work together as a team to survive. They tested out the idea by making a small multiplayer minigame where the players would try to survive for as long as possible, but since they couldn't come up with any creative ways to actually force the players to work together, everyone just ended up trying to fend for themselves the whole time, and the game supposedly became pretty boring pretty quickly. This led the team to the conclusion that what makes Resident Evil so scary was actually its lack of multiplayer, and the fact that players need to survive on their own without being able to rely on others, so they ultimately just scrapped the minigame and gave up on the idea. That is, until late 2001 at least. See, with the PlayStation 2 actually being capable of online network play, unlike the PlayStation 1 which only had system link functionality, Capcom decided to revive the idea and use the research gathered from the first attempt to improve the overall experience. But interestingly, development of this title would be handled by Capcom's Production Studio 1 rather than Mikami's Studio 4. This was an interesting decision to say the least, as Production Studio 1 was primarily responsible for developing action and fighting games like Devil May Cry 2 and the Capcom vs SNK series. The man assigned to direct this revived project would be Eiichiro Sasaki, and if that name sounds familiar to any of you, it's probably because he would later go on to direct everyone's favorite Resident Evil game. As far as we know, development from this point on actually went really smoothly, and Resident Evil Outbreak would eventually be released to the world in December of 2003. So would Outbreak manage to stick the landing and go down as a classic Resident Evil title, or would all the factors working against it end up ultimately holding it back? Well, let's talk about it. But before getting too far into the video, I should mention that this is the 11th in a series of videos where I'm playing and reviewing every game in the Resident Evil franchise in release order. You don't have to have seen the other videos in the series in order to enjoy this one, but you'll definitely have some better context and probably get more enjoyment out of this video if you have seen the rest of them. So for those of you that are interested in checking out the others first, I'll have the full series playlist in the description below. But with that out of the way, Resident Evil Outbreak is a co-op survival horror game developed and published by Capcom for the PlayStation 2 in 2003. And I know that right off the bat, a lot of you are going to be wondering how I went about playing this one, and answering that will conveniently also explain why there's been a nearly month-long gap between this and my last RE video. I decided that to get the proper Outbreak experience, I would need to play it with at least one friend along for the ride. So I reached out to my good friend and real-life anime woman False, who just so happens to be a huge horror game fan and a pretty big RE fan since childhood, much like myself. She had also never played either of the Outbreak games, so it was a pretty natural fit since we wouldn't have any sort of knowledge about the game that you otherwise wouldn't on a first playthrough. The only issue was that Outbreak's servers got taken down all the way back in 2007, so the only way to play the game online nowadays is by connecting to a fan server. Luckily though, thanks to some very dedicated members of the community, such a server does exist. The catch being that it's only compatible with Japanese copies of Outbreak. So if we wanted to play online, we had to mail order a couple of Japanese copies of the game, wait for them to arrive, and then dump them to PC so that we could patch them back into English and play them online through an emulator, since neither of us really wanted to mod our PS2s to be compatible with Japanese games. So yeah, it was a bit of a process for us to get here, but thankfully False was more than willing to do all that to help out with the video, and also just to play through the entire thing with me, so definitely go and show her some love on her channels that I'll have linked in the description below. Anyway, Resident Evil Outbreak takes place during the Raccoon City outbreak from Resident Evil 2 and 3. The game actually opens with the very beginnings of the outbreak, with our characters all just hanging out in a local bar when everything starts going to hell. From here, we get a variety of smaller scale scenarios that see us moving through certain areas of Raccoon City in our attempts to escape. The game even spans the entirety of the Raccoon City outbreak, with the final scenario on offer here ending just minutes before the nuke from the end of RE3 hits the city. Due to the game's multiplayer nature though, it's very light on story, so much so that the various scenarios don't even take place in chronological order or really have any connective tissue whatsoever. That being said though, for you Resident Evil lore heads out there are some dates and such scattered throughout the game that will allow you to still piece everything together on your own if you really want to. Just know that if you prefer a more direct form of storytelling, you're not going to get that here, as the team was clearly just concerned with making a strong co-op gameplay experience. At its core though, this is your pretty standard Resident Evil fare. The game uses tank controls and fixed camera angles, you run around looking for weapons, ammo, heals, and key items, and try to make those resources last long enough to ultimately find a way out of whatever awful situation you're stuck in. But as you might imagine, the multiplayer nature of Outbreak ends up changing the experience by quite a bit. Since the designers understood that you'd be playing the game's various scenarios over and over again with your friends, they went ahead and randomized some of the item spawns to prevent players from just memorizing the entire thing and overly optimizing their runs. On top of that, the game also offers 5 unique difficulties ranging from very easy to very hard, and things like item placements and enemy spawns are changed around between each of these various difficulties, just adding another layer of randomization here. And to take that even further, the designers gave players a total of 8 unique playable characters to choose from, with each of them having their own unique abilities and statistics compared to the others. This was well above and beyond what they needed to do, since the game is only even playable with up to 4 players at any given time. So they easily could have just made 4 different characters and called it a day, but instead they gave you a total selection of 8. And their unique traits all make really big differences in how your scenario will play out. For example, most characters in this game only have 4 inventory slots to work with, but Yoko has a backpack that expands her inventory all the way to 8 slots. Some characters like Kevin or Mark not only get to start each scenario with a handgun already in their inventory, but their handguns are also stored in a special 5th slot that can't be used for anything else. So ultimately, they get to carry their handguns around for free without them taking up any space. And the biggest game changer here is probably Alyssa, who has a set of lockpicking tools that will occasionally grant access to lockers, drawers, or even entire rooms that wouldn't have been accessible otherwise. These always have great items in them too, like extra first aid sprays, shotguns, and even assault rifles if you're really lucky. Some scenarios will even have certain characters starting out in different locations from one another based on where they are in the introduction cutscene, which is a small but really nice touch to add a little more weight to your choice, as choosing your favorite survivor will sometimes mean starting off your run separated from the rest of the team. And for that little cherry on top, each character typically gets their own unique intro and outro cutscene for every scenario as well, showcasing what your exact character is doing or thinking in that exact moment, while other players get to see what their character is doing or thinking as well. That's only a very brief description of half of the available characters, but it's more than enough to give those of you who have never played the game a good idea of just how big of a difference your character selections actually make here. To contrast the strong variety of the playable characters though, there's the lack of variety in the game's scenarios. Not in the sense that these scenarios don't all feel meaningfully different from one another, because believe me, they do, but more in the sense that there just aren't very many to choose from. The final release of the game saw a total of 5 scenarios to choose from when playing, but allegedly, more than 2/3 of the game's originally planned scenarios were cut during development due to the game having a pretty rushed development cycle. Outbreak was originally meant to have a total of 18 different scenarios, complete with a large interconnected storyline to tie them all together, but the team ultimately had to cut it down to just the 5 I mentioned a second ago, as well as cutting the interconnected storyline, leaving the selection here feeling a bit limited. But like I said just a minute ago, these scenarios are totally unique to one another, and all of them offer an entirely different experience to players. The game's first scenario will see you frantically escaping from zombies during the initial chaos of the Raccoon City outbreak, but then the second is a much more slowly paced journey through the Umbrella Lab beneath the RPD. Then the third will see players trying to escape from Raccoon General Hospital while being chased down by an invincible stalker enemy, and the fourth will have you working your way through a hotel that's in the process of burning down while also trying to sneak your way around a very large population of lickers. They all need to be approached in totally different ways, and even though there are only 5 scenarios, it is good to see that there's a high level of variety in the level design and the gameplay design between the 5 that we got. That being said though, not all of these scenarios are totally enjoyable to play through. I personally loved the scenario in the burning hotel, as well as the final scenario set in Raccoon University, but I also personally hated the scenarios set in the hospital and the initial outbreak for reasons that we'll come back to soon. But what I think is really interesting here is that everyone who plays this game will have completely different preferences when it comes to these scenarios. False's opinions on these didn't even totally line up with mine, despite the fact that we played the entire thing together the whole way through, with her favorite being the underground lab, and with her least favorite also being the hospital scenario, because, well, it's shit. And I'm sure there are plenty of players out there who will love the initial outbreak scenario or hate the burning hotel one, because these are all ultimately going to come down to personal preference at the end of the day. And call me a big nerd all you want, but I personally love stuff like that in games because it leads to a lot of good discussion around what works in certain levels and what doesn't in others. And even though I might not like the hospital scenario very much, getting to revisit the hospital from RE3 in such higher fidelity was an awesome treat. And with me being the massive RE2 fanboy that I am, the same absolutely goes for the revisit to the underground lab from that game. Both of these areas are massively expanded as well, with both of them easily having double the real estate they did in their original appearances, if not triple, which makes them still feel really fresh to explore for longtime fans. It's some great nostalgia for fans of the classics like myself, and I'd be lying if I said that I didn't start nerding out a bit when I would run into a room from RE2 that had been remade 1-to-1 here. And hopefully any of you who plan on playing Outbreak for yourself someday get that much enjoyment out of them too, because you'll be playing these scenarios a lot. Like, a whole lot. See, Resident Evil Outbreak is an incredibly punishing game. Since there would only be 5 scenarios in the full release, the developers were afraid that players would blast through all of the content and get bored of Outbreak rather quickly. So they went back to a tried and true method of stretching a game's value and runtime. That being just making the game really damn hard. Most of the scenarios are filled with continuous zombie spawns that will really put the pressure on players to move through environments quickly. If you stick in one area too long, you'll eventually run out of ammo from fighting off the never-ending zombies, and your team will be overrun. So the game forces players to be moving through everything as quickly as possible to ensure that they can find enough ammo and healing items to make it to the end of a scenario, which is something that I'm really not a fan of. Not entirely because I think that this alone is too difficult, because quite frankly, it's not, but more because it disrupts that careful balance that always made the classic Resi games so special to me. Anytime that you're met with an enemy in those games, you can run away from them to try to save some ammo, but at the risk of wasting a healing item if you get hit. Or you can use some of your ammo stockpile to put them down, which will then make the area a lot safer on return trips and ensure that those healing items can be saved for a potential boss fight later on. Having infinitely spawning enemies disrupts this balance a good deal, since you still have that careful balance of ammo and healing items, but dropping an enemy will only actually make the area safe for about 15 seconds before a new one takes its place. Add on to this that every single scenario here has a boss fight at the end of it, and you have a recipe that ultimately results in killing enemies just not being worthwhile. I mean, seriously, False and I would rarely ever put an enemy down unless we absolutely had to here, and even then, we would be completing those final boss fights with barely any ammo to spare. And to put even more pressure on players, the developers also gave zombies the ability to move between rooms as they please, which was definitely a surprising addition here. Zombies following players from one room to another isn't exactly a new thing for the series, as the RE1 remake actually already did that. But such encounters were all hard scripted and deliberately designed in that game. Here though, the zombies will legitimately just follow you around as you move through the scenario, once again forcing you into making the decision of either shooting them or just trying to continuously run away. And if it weren't for the infinite spawns, I definitely would have loved this inclusion here. But with the infinite spawns, it just felt like it was a bit too much at times and could lead to moments where we would be running away from a group of like 5 zombies in order to save our ammo for the upcoming boss fight. Now, there is an added mechanic here where a player can go and push themselves up against a door to prevent the zombies from breaking in, but this will only hold them back for so long, and obviously the more zombies that are trying to come in, the faster they're going to break down the door regardless. And that's not the only way that Outbreak pushes players into moving through scenarios quickly, with the other mechanic pushing you to do so probably being my single least favorite thing about the entire game. That being the virus gauge. See, every player in Outbreak starts each scenario with a 0% infection rating, but as you spend more time in the city, that gauge will slowly start to fill, effectively putting a timer on each scenario, as reaching 100% infection will immediately kill the player. Each character has their own unique infection rate, so for example, playing as Kevin will give you a shorter timer than playing as David will. On top of that, any time that you take any form of damage, your infection rating will spike, bringing you ever closer to that instant game over. This, in my opinion, is the worst example of artificial difficulty in the game. I've been playing the Resident Evil games for nearly my entire life, and while I'm not the best player out there, I'm more than good enough at these games to play through entries like Code Veronica or RE0 for the first time in years with hardly any deaths during my entire run. If a player like me is given the time to slowly and carefully approach these games with little to no knowledge, it's easy enough for them to get through with barely any issue. But playing through Outbreak for the first time was absolutely brutal for us. Between the infinite enemy spawns that were almost constantly forcing us to keep running between rooms as quickly as possible, as well as a literal reset timer ticking down the entire time, False and I were rushed to figure things out as quickly as possible while we were still trying to learn how to play the game. Which of course led to tons of poor decisions being made along the way that would ultimately lead to us either dying from a lack of healing items or just running out of time. I mean, to put it into perspective, completing the game's 5 scenarios took us a little over 16 hours, which shows you just how much this artificial difficulty pads out the runtime of the game when you consider that a run of these will typically take 30 minutes to an hour apiece. And I get that this was made to be a co-op game and that the devs had to make the package feel worthwhile, but I don't think that making the normal difficulty this crushingly oppressive was the way to go about that. I mean, sure, hindsight is 20/20, but look at how arguably the best co-op game ever made, Left 4 Dead, handles it. You give players an entry point where they can feel challenged, but one where they can still reasonably get through a full run while they're getting to grips with the game. Then, once they've had the chance to learn the game and really get into it, you can include some more challenging modes to give players that hardcore experience that they'll inevitably be looking for. One of my biggest pet peeves in gaming is when it feels like my time is being intentionally wasted, and with each of Outbreak's scenarios taking a solid few tries to get through since you basically just need to learn the layout and the routes ahead of time, it absolutely made me feel like it was just padding itself out at the expense of my patience. It's one thing for a game to be hard, but it's another thing entirely for a game to add mechanics or systems to an established formula with the sole intention of making the game take longer to complete. And unfortunately, Outbreak has a couple of those systems itself. Okay, so with that admittedly emotional rant out of the way, I should really emphasize that there's still plenty to love about Resident Evil Outbreak. I'm sure I lost a few of you during all that rambling, but I really didn't want to end the video on such a negative note. So for those of you that did somehow stick through it, let's talk about what makes Outbreak so awesome. The biggest thing that I somehow haven't called attention to yet is just how ahead of its time this game's multiplayer actually was. I mean, seriously, once you're logged into the game's servers, you can simply just head over to the server browser and create a room for you and your friends to play in. You can set how many players you want to allow in the lobby, set a password so that no one you don't want to join can actually join, and then play through the entire game from beginning to end with your friends. This all might sound really normal nowadays, but that's kind of my point. This was a PS2 exclusive released in 2003, and yet, it uses a server browser system that is exactly what we still use for numerous PC games more than 20 years later. Beyond that, the game also works within its limitations to facilitate cooperation between players. Aside from just needing to coordinate things like inventory management and who has what key item, there are also some additional mechanics that will push players into sticking together and working as a team. The first of these is what the game calls the ad-lib system. This is a neat little addition where you can activate certain preset voice lines for your character by pointing the right thumbstick in a specific direction. These lines will be things like telling someone to follow you, calling for help, and just other basic voice shouts that you might need to communicate with other players. This obviously goes a super long way to facilitate communication between players prior to consoles having built-in voice chat systems like they do nowadays. It's something that can easily be taken for granted when playing the game nowadays and using something like Discord the way False and I did, but back then, this would have been a really big deal. Then there's the new bleeding mechanic that can randomly be triggered whenever you take some damage. If a player starts bleeding, they'll go into this extremely slow limping state in which even the basic zombies will be moving around the room faster than you are. This obviously leaves you open to a pretty swift death if you start bleeding with no one else around, but if other players are nearby, they can actually grab you and quickly pull you away to safety. And if they don't want to do that, they can of course just kill whatever enemy was about to turn you into their dinner and buy you some time to heal up and get moving again. And then of course, there's the down state the players will enter if they die to an enemy. As you might expect, a teammate can obviously go over to these players and pick them up to prevent them from dying and being unable to continue playing the scenario. But the way that the designers went about making a downed player an urgent priority is actually pretty interesting. When you go down an Outbreak, rather than getting a generic bleed out timer, your virus gauge will actually start to fill up incredibly quickly. So if you already have a high virus gauge when you go down, you won't be able to remain in this down state for long before fully dying out. And regardless of how full your virus gauge was when you went down, the longer you remained in the down state, the shorter your death timer will be for the entire rest of the run once you do get up. So as you can probably imagine, if a teammate goes down an Outbreak, you'll need to basically drop whatever you're doing to get them back up as quickly as possible. It's another really clever way of pushing players to stick together and work as a team, because while you can just have everyone split up and go complete different objectives to try to speedrun the scenario, you run a considerable risk by having everyone separated like that. Oh, and I left this fun twist for when I talked about going down and bleeding out, but if a player's virus gauge actually hits 100%, they don't necessarily just die. Instead, your character will turn into a zombie, and you'll be able to control that zombie to go and take your teammates down with you. You obviously don't have to go and kill your teammates when you turn, as you're still perfectly in control of your character, but if I'm not finishing this scenario, then no one is finishing this scenario. It's just another one of those little additions that, while not entirely necessary, does just make Outbreak feel a little more special by being there. Overall though, Resident Evil Outbreak is a game that I have some very mixed feelings on. The artificial difficulty frustrated the hell out of me, but I'm sure that this is a little less frustrating each time you go back to replay the game, since simply knowing your way around the scenarios and mechanics goes a really long way here. And I mean, come on guys, it's a classic style Resident Evil game that you can play through with up to 3 of your friends. How could I ever not like Outbreak with a concept like that? I may not totally agree with every part of its execution, but it's just such a cool idea, and getting to play through it with a friend was really awesome, even if I needed a little time to cool off after every few hours of playing. The fact that this game can still feel so much like classic Resident Evil despite being built around co-op play is really incredible, and I seriously hope that there's some sort of official re-release or remaster someday that will make this one a lot easier for fans to get into. It might be far from my favorite game that we've covered in the series so far, but it's definitely one of the coolest, and one that I wish more players could get the chance to properly experience. So at the end of the day, I'm going to give Resident Evil Outbreak a 7.1. Hey guys, thanks for making it all the way through another video. If you enjoyed it, consider throwing a quick like or a sub my way to help out with that whole algorithm thing. We are going into January after all, so it's probably going to be kicking my ass here pretty soon. And while you're at it, don't forget to go and check out False's channels and show her some love for helping to make this video possible. As always, a massive thank you to everyone who supports the channel through Patreon and YouTube memberships. You guys really do add some much needed stability to these long-running series, and I can't thank you enough for that. But with all the thank yous and begging for likes out of the way, I'm gonna let you guys go and get back to working on the next video. So thank you all again for watching, and I hope to see all of you right back here for the next Resident Evil review.